Well, William, I know that the viewers have been complaining about how your hair always looks bad on camera, so I think it was nice of you to put a little effort in this morning.
Well, I would take issue with always complaining, considering I've really only been on camera once in the entire time. But I want to look good for our True North supporters and True North people who like our programming.
That's not true. You were a pretty regular during the Alberta election, if I remember correctly, and on our election night show.
Well, that's true. As an Albertan, I'm always excited when we cover Alberta topics. I think a real strength that we have as an organization is we have dedicated and wonderful journalists like you and Isaac covering Alberta and its important issues.
It's the second time you've lied on this show. You're talking about how much you admire us and that you only did your hair the one time. I'm nervous for how
Well,
this.
we are covering CBC later. Maybe I'm just getting in a CBC frame of mind by delivering false news.
It's also Isaac. How do you feel that you're losing your True North podcast virginity today?
I, I don't know that I necessarily feel that way because I do the daily brief usually at least once a week, sometimes numerous times, and that feels like a podcast to me. Although there's
Okay,
no
video
video portion, of
podcast.
course. Yeah, the videos. I don't know how I feel about it. Of course, I'm excited to have the opportunity to be on video, but it is definitely new. So.
Well, maybe next time you'll remember to do your hair when you're on camera. But I think, all right, guys, let's get it started. Hey everyone, welcome to Off the Record. In the words of Andrew Lawton, our regular show host, this is sort of True North's fun Friday show. I'm Rachel Emmanuel. I'll be hosting the show today, and I am joined by William McBeath and Isaac Lamoureux. Isaac is new to the video podcasting format. Welcome to the show, both.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
So we actually have a Alberta-based crew today, which is a pretty rare thing. Everyone here on the show is based in Alberta. William and I coming to you from Calgary, and Isaac from Edmonton. I actually believe that Isaac is coming for my crown as the Alberta reporter. He's actually introduced himself on a couple occasions now as a new Alberta reporter. So we'll see how he does today. You guys can let us know in the comments what you think. Maybe, I might have to give up my Alberta Roundup show in replace of a new fan favorite. But Isaac, you've been doing some great work on the Alberta coverage. I use it regularly in my shows on Saturdays. And I know that you've been following Bill 20 pretty closely. This is a very controversial piece of legislation. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, she's had to defend this multiple times since it was announced. The Alberta government said, there's going to be amendments introduced. So why don't you break it down for us? What's really going on here? Why is this bill so controversial?
Yeah, thanks. So obviously there's a lot of things within Bill 20, but when I first read it, one of the things that stood out to me was the introduction of political parties at the municipal level. I mean, obviously this is a huge change to municipal politics within Alberta. And so they're introducing a pilot project for local political parties, which will occur in Edmonton and Calgary during the next municipal election. And local candidates aren't required to join a political party, but will be given the opportunity to do so. As far as I understand, all the candidates on the voting list will have a party next to their name. And obviously it could show independent if a candidate did not want to join a party. Also, something interesting to note is that each municipal party will be independent in the sense that a municipal party within Edmonton versus one in Calgary will have no relation. There's lots of rules around that, how they can't even share with the provincial government, the federal government, their parties within those. They can't share any information, that kind of thing.
I think that was one of the more, something were more excited about that part of the bill. Not everyone accepted it, but I think that was one of the more accepted things of the bill. Another thing that it's going to do is it's going to ban tabulators. So in provincial elections and in municipal elections, tabulators, which are used to tally the vote, will not be allowed to be used anymore. Of course, some people took issue with this, but a lot of praise for the premier on this. And then on the controversial side of things, one of the things that the bill would also do is it would allow the provincial government to fire city councillors in extreme circumstances, and also to basically undo city bylaws. Say, you know what, we're going to cancel that city bylaw. We have Calgary Mayor Jody Gondik responding to this bill. She was very critical of it. Let's play that clip of what she had to say about it and some of her concerns.
So right now, all it says is removal of a council member if it's in the public's interest, but public interest is not defined. I do know that Minister McIver has said something to the effect of public interest can be defined as public push or public request. I still don't know what that looks like. And in an age where recall exists, does it now mean that you can file a recall petition against someone and that becomes the grounds for cabinet making a move towards removal? It's all unclear. It doesn't mesh together well, and public interest has to be defined very clearly for the public.
William, what's your take on this?
Well, I would have to laugh because I think one of the reasons Mayor Gondek is so concerned is because of how deeply unpopular she is. And of course, she's concerned about a public push because at 30% approval, she could well be a target of removal. So I can understand why she's a bit concerned. All of that being said, I think the goal of the bill is simply to have a mechanism to remove city councillors or other municipal elected officials when they really go off the wire and maybe move into areas or adopt policy positions that are completely contrary to what has been established in areas like that are outside their area of jurisdiction, so areas that are under the governance of the province. That being said, there's already mechanisms to deal with errant elected officials. I'm not sure there's a lot of need to have a separate bill to enshrine that power. But I do think it reflects the fact that so many of our city councils have gone way off the deep end on issues. Mayor Gondek herself, for example, said one of her jobs was to lead the resistance to the province's changes to gender rights and parental rights policy. Well, I really don't think that's actually the job of the Mayor of Calgary. The job of the Mayor of Calgary is to try and deliver the core services that Calgarians expect: plowing the snow, filling the potholes, collecting the garbage. All things, by the way, that Calgary does not do particularly well, despite taking a lot of dollars from our property taxes.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm inclined to agree with you. I think there's already mechanisms for a lot of the things that the government can deal with here, especially when it comes to removing city councillors. I do like the areas of this bill that focus on, for example, banning the tabulators. I don't have any issue with creating, political parties in municipalities. I'm totally fine with that. I don't like the provincial government stepping in and saying, we're going to undo city bylaws, we're going to fire councillors. Even in extreme circumstances, I don't think the solution to bad government is more government. I think this is government overreach from the provincial government. I think that in Calgary, if we say this city councillor sucks or our city council as a whole sucks, that's when Calgarians need to get involved and do what they can to remove those councillors. We just had a recall petition for Jody Gondek. That was unsuccessful, partly because the parameters for the petition were so extreme. They needed over 500,000 signatures. I interviewed the individual leading the petition many occasions. He said, well, there's no way we're going to get that many signatures because there's such a large portion of the population in Calgary that doesn't speak English. We can barely talk to them to, explain to them what we're doing here. But the provincial government has already said, you know what, we're going to look at the petition and we're going to amend that legislation so that it's more reasonable. So they already have an avenue for dealing with that. If Calgarians take issue with their government, they need to really get involved and vote them out at the next election or seek to recall them. But I don't like this provincial government stepping in and saying we're going to have rights. And for people who do support this, for conservatives who do support this piece of legislation and the mechanism specifically for the provincial government to step in and fire city councillors, how would they feel if we had an Alberta NDP government right now pushing forward this legislation? Because we might have an Alberta NDP government again one day, and I would be curious to see which city councillors they're going to be targeting. So I think this legislation needs to be severely amended. I take some serious issues with it. Another thing the Alberta government is doing right now is they are pushing a high-speed railway. Now, I did a show on this earlier this week, and I had a lot of viewers say, oh, we've been talking about high-speed rail in the province for years, never going to happen. Well, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith seems to love trains and seems that she really wants to push this forward. The government has said they're going to spend $9 million studying what this would look like. That includes ridership demand and infrastructure needs. $9 million just to study this. That's before anything is even built. And there would be 6 phases to this plan. First of all, they want to connect the airports in Edmonton and Calgary to the downtown cities. They also want to connect Edmonton and Calgary to each other through a high-speed rail. And they want to connect places like Calgary to Banff and Edmonton to Jasper. So it's an interesting idea. I don't know that we're really in the place to be spending money on this right now. I think a lot of people would rather see that money spent on one-time payments to families or, removing the fuel tax altogether. But I had the Alberta director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Chris Sims, on my show this week to discuss. Here's what she had to say about it.
That's a great question. It kind of surprised me when I saw the announcement. And so the answer is no. We hear from supporters of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who are, by the way, by and large, pretty big fans of Premier Danielle Smith. So they're quite often on her side. I hadn't seen one email in the last 2 years asking for this sort of a thing.
So, William, you've lived in Alberta for a long time. You've lived in Calgary a long time. What do you think of this plan? Is a high-speed rail something that you're just desperate to have in the province?
Yeah, I mean, Danielle Smith has always been a big fan of rail. This was something when I worked for her back in the Wellrose days. She was very gung ho on rail opportunity. The question is there a business case for it? Does it make financial sense for Alberta? Anyone who's driven Highway 2 in the past couple years knows that we are absolutely at capacity on that corridor, that you can't put thousands more car trips every day onto that road at just 2 lanes for large chunks of it. So I do think there's a conversation to be had around what we're going to do about overcrowding on Highway 2 between Edmonton and Calgary and how we can alleviate that. Speaking personally, I would love a train that goes from downtown Calgary to the airport. I think my family who lives in Edmonton, they live in downtown Edmonton. Getting from downtown Edmonton to their airport is a $120 taxi trip, and that's each way. So $240 tacked onto your trip in order to be able to take a flight somewhere, go away for a vacation, I think is an issue. Whether or not high-speed rail or commuter rail is the answer, I don't know. I suppose that's what we'll learn from the study. But I don't think we should commit to anything just because we like rail or we think trains are cool. I thought trains were cool when I was a kid. I didn't get billions of dollars to go out and build a train set or build a train because of it. So let's see, I guess, what the study turns out.
Yeah, I think that what you've addressed sort of goes back to one of the reasons that the government is pushing this is just the population growth. There's about 4.9 million people in Alberta now. That population has already increased rapidly just in the last few years. And the government is predicting 7.1 million Albertans by 2051. So they are expecting rapid population growth. I don't think that surprises anyone. We've seen how people are flooding to the cities from elsewhere in Canada in search of more affordability. But one of the questions I have is, rail from downtown Calgary to the airport, I'm sure that would be useful for a lot of people. Even maybe there's an argument for a railway from Calgary to Edmonton. When we're talking about a railway from Edmonton to Jasper, from Calgary to Banff, it's like, what are you going to do when you get there? You're going to wait around in the cold for the bus? That sounds awful. What do you think, Isaac?
Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, I've lived in Alberta almost all of my life, and it's nice to conceptualize, I suppose, a railway system similar to the ones they have in Europe, where you can kind of just take the train wherever you want to, especially the mountains. But like you said, I mean, that's without thinking of all the issues that come along with it, like, oh, when you actually get to the mountain, then what? But just speaking quickly to the rails, I remember when I first wrote my rail story, the lead I went with was the Alberta government said that this time will be different because, as you both know, we've been talking about railways in Alberta for what seems like forever now. But the key difference to note here is that the government has said, look, in the past, we've kind of just tried to focus on this project or this project and this project, but this thing we're doing now, this master rail plan, is a holistic approach. We're looking at all these projects together. How can we get this thing done? This is the way forward. So maybe that's the way to do it, and this holistic approach will actually come to fruition. We'll see, I guess.
Well, speaking of holistic approaches, the Ontario Provincial Police are looking at ways to reduce bad driving in the province, I guess. Seems like there's been an exponential increase of accidents and the OPP is becoming increasingly concerned. They have a new initiative to try to deal with some of these issues. Isaac, you covered the story this week. What is going on in Ontario right now?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. Basically, if you're pulled over on an Ontario highway, you will be forced to take a breath test no matter what. They don't need suspicion, which was they don't need suspicion because of legislation that was passed in 2018, which essentially gives police the right to do this if they have an approved screening device on their persons, which when I talked to criminal defense lawyer Sean Robichaud, he said that all police forces are starting to just equip all their officers with these automatic devices. So basically, anyone who's pulled over on the highway, regardless of the reason, so speeding, seatbelt, anything, you're going to be forced to do a mandatory breath test. And if you refuse to do it, I wouldn't recommend that because you'll be subject to essentially being guilty by default. And just a quick note was that when I initially wrote the story, I just used breathalyzers, but Robichaud reached out to me saying, hey, just so you know, automatic screening devices, which the police have on their persons, are different from breathalyzers, which are normally at police stations, which are a much larger device. And as far as I understand with the legislation, they don't actually need cause to administer the breath test with the automatic screening device, but they do need cause to do the breathalyzers at the police station.
And what's been some of the public reaction to this so far? Are people generally supportive, or are people taking issue with this, Isaac?
Yeah, so the public reaction, especially on our Twitter posts that we've posted on True North, people are very, I guess, upset. A lot of people are obviously concerned about this being a charter violation. When I talked to the criminal defense lawyer, Sean Robichaud, he said the opposite, kind of. He said, look, the charter is a simple document. It's used to help courts determine what legislation and laws are, but once those laws are determined in the courts, which he said this has been up to the Supreme Court of Canada, the laws are what they are. So the charter doesn't really help you in that sense. And just to read the charter here, Section 8 of the charter states, everyone has the right to be secure against unreasonable search or seizure. And Section 9 states, everyone has the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. But I guess the Supreme Court of Canada found that this is a minimally intrusive thing that the police are doing with these automatic breathalyzers, breath tests.
I have to say that I think this is largely a response just to some of the mass immigration that we're seeing, especially in Toronto and the GTA area. I lived in Niagara for most of my life. In the past few years, there's so much traffic from Toronto to Niagara, from leaving Toronto, heading out towards the east, towards Ottawa. Increasing amounts of accidents. There's the highway's always plugged up. Seems like people don't know what they're doing on the road these days. I obviously haven't lived in Ontario for a couple of years now, but it seems like every summer my family's messaging me saying traffic is just getting worse and worse. You can't even get in that stretch from Beamsville to St. Catharines without getting plugged up. And there's just been a lot of really horrific accidents. So I would assume this is sort of a response to some of the issues that we're seeing with people really not driving well. Maybe there's also some issues with people actually not really knowing how to drive, in addition to people driving under the influence, which is becoming more common since we've legalized marijuana, obviously. I'm not going to say I'm in favor of the policy, but I would say that it's sort of a natural reaction to simply letting too many people in the country. I think that we actually need to start fixing some of the real issues as opposed to just putting Band-Aid fixes on things. William, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone objects to getting drunk drivers off the road. I think as a policy goal, pretty well everybody's united that we shouldn't have people who are drunk out there driving. The worry is that well-intentioned pieces of legislation can set bad precedents, and they can allow the erosion of our freedoms and our rights under the guise of trying to achieve positive policy outcomes. So I think we have to be very careful whenever there's a new law that in some way curtails or limits something that we have enjoyed as a right or a freedom, even if we think that the goal of the policy is well-intentioned. And I think that's, in this case, what the concern a lot of people have is not about getting drunk drivers off the road, but simply giving law enforcement more power to exercise in an arbitrary manner against ordinary Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, while we're taking a look at Ontario, let's go over to Ottawa. There was a little bit of drama in one of the House of Commons committee meetings. I know, that never happens. William, you've went all over this one. What happened in the House of Commons Canadian Heritage Committee this week?
Well, I think I'm amongst many people who enjoy seeing the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation get a swift kick in the pants. We find them very high-handed and taking an awful lot of our tax dollars. So what happened was that the president of CBC, Catherine Tate, was brought before the Heritage Committee and asked yet again about bonuses for CBC executives. As you may know, CBC executives get annual performance bonuses. Not a lot of good news, though, at CBC. So a lot of people are starting to wonder whether or not these bonuses are merited. I can tell you my personal opinion that they're not. But MP Rachel Thomas took aim at Catherine Tate and wanted to know the details of when we'd learn about bonuses. And you can see that in the clip. It was quite a fiery exchange between the two.
Have you made recommendations with your management team as to whether or not the 8 top executives get bonuses for the 2023-2024 fiscal year?
We have not.
No recommendations have been made?
No, we have not.
When will those recommendations be made?
At the June board meeting.
So by the board, management team will have nothing to do with the
No,
recommendation?
we will present the results. We will present the results
Okay.
of the financial year and the results of the KPIs, and we will have an opportunity to discuss them. And the HRGC, which is the Human Resources and Governance Committee, will review them,
Thank you.
and they will make their
And
recommendation
your
to the
management
board.
team.
Basically, Thomas pushed and said we really want to see some data on whether or not they're getting bonuses. Catherine Tate, in a pretty emphatic manner, saying that information isn't available, which I think is surprising for a lot of people, considering the fiscal year is already well over. And just looking at CBC's performance, particularly in the past year or so, you really have to wonder how they're justifying executive bonuses. They're laying off hundreds of their employees. They're planning to lay off hundreds more of their employees. Viewership is at an all-time low. There's an absolute crisis happening about what the role of the CBC is, whether or not it's justified, whether or not existing in its current format is in any way a positive net for Canadians. And of course, likely future Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre has said that there will be a massive shakeup at CBC, if not an outright defunding and shutting it down. So all of that put together, I'm not sure equals big bonuses for CBC executives are justified.
Catherine Tate was actually the winner of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation Teddy Waste Award, beating out even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So I don't think it gets much worse than that, beating out Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for an award on waste. But yeah, you can see how indignant she is there when she's being questioned. Seems a little bit like someone who maybe has a little bit something to hide. But this is the issue that we always see, whether it's with just the federal government or anything that receives federal funding, is just sort of the lack of accountability. And as soon as there's government money in a situation, it seems that people, they just don't care. They're not accountable to the private sector, where there's actually much higher standards. They're handing out bonuses for who knows what. I guess for losing all those viewers, for handing all of them to us, I think is probably what they're celebrating there. Maybe Catherine Tate is secretly a conservative, and she's actually celebrating that her organization's bad coverage, biased coverage, has sent a lot of people over to outlets like us. Isaac, what's your take?
Yeah, I don't know. The first thing that comes to mind is, as you mentioned, Rachel, there's obviously a lack of accountability there. The CBC is getting over $1 billion in taxpayer dollars on an annual basis, and all their shows are bleeding money. Their organization as a whole can't even show a profit. So I don't know how any of that money is warranted. And as you mentioned, William, it'll be very interesting to me to see if Poilievre takes office, what he's going to do with the CBC, because obviously he's been very vocal in his pledge to defund them, but I don't know that he can really just squash the company as a whole. And I don't know how it could really be reformatted into something that could be justifiable long-term, in the sense that it won't be biased towards whatever government's in power, and it can actually be what it's supposed to be, which is, I guess, an unbiased state broadcaster. I mean, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
Well, I just don't think we need a state broadcaster. I think we don't need to squash the CBC. We just need to take taxpayer dollars from them. If they want to do the hard work of finding those private dollars on their own, which I know they already do receive some private funding, they can continue to do that and make a go for it on their own. It's just, I don't want to be funding it. I don't agree with my tax dollars being used to push a liberal narrative and to run cover for the Trudeau Liberals time and time again. It's actually very frustrating. But if they want to continue running as an organization without my tax dollars, I have no issue with that. I think we're kind of in an era where people more and more are saying, listen, media is partisan. A lot of media, they seem to have bias. They seem to have an ideology which sort of frames their coverage. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. But what is the issue is, one, when people try to hide it and say, oh, we're fair, mainstream media, we cover the government equally, which is obviously not the case. Or alternatively, when they're receiving taxpayer dollars for it, and we have one party which says, we'll continue funding you, we'll give you all the money for your bonuses and for all your reporters that, are pushing the trans agenda, things like that. And another party, the Conservative Party, which is saying we would actually pull funding from the CBC. So even at space, you just know you're not going to get fair coverage, which we're not getting. And we've pointed it out here at True North time and time again. I think one of my favorite things that Pierre Poilievre has said time and time again is that he would actually empty the CBC headquarters in Ottawa and make it housing. He often talks about the young families he can see moving in. I think that's a pretty nice image for us all. But William, what's your prediction? If we were to have a Conservative government, What do you think they would actually do on the CBC? Would we really see them remove all those taxpayer dollars? Or do you think they'll maybe wash down what they've promised to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can say personally, I really hope so. I think for people who supported Stephen Harper and the Harper government for a 10-year period, the failure to do something about CBC really stands out as something left undone, and something that a lot of people were really wishing that Prime Minister Harper could have tackled during his time in office. Because, of course, it is not a fair and unbiased news machine. This is a network funded by taxpayer dollars who sued the Conservative Party during an election campaign and then had their lawsuit dismissed as being frivolous and without merit. So the fact that they make that kind of poor decision just shows you that the rot that has set in at CBC, right up to the top, right up to Catherine Tate, who enjoys, apparently, although we don't know the details, some form of executive compensation bonus. I think there is a lot that can be done. And I would say particularly English language CBC television is where most people are directing their ire. The idea that we have an English language television network when there's already 5, 6, 7, 8 more private sector competitors just shows that this is not needed anymore. And yeah, fingers crossed that a new Poilievre government will do what it takes to fix or ditch CBC.
I can say that back when I worked on Parliament Hill covering the federal government, that was, I guess, three and a half years ago now, maybe not quite that long, but there wasn't a lot of love for the CBC, even among the other mainstream journalism outlets. People felt like the CBC got an unfair deal, that they had extra funding. And there was even some complaints that with the amount of funding that the CBC gets, they are not breaking big stories. It's other outlets like Global News, the Globe and Mail. They're the ones who are breaking a lot of the bigger stories. CBC then is following those stories. But considering the insane amount of funding they're getting, they're not really doing entrepreneurial journalism. We're seeing that from a lot of the outlets that receive far less than federal funding. Of course, all outlets basically receiving some funding nowadays, except for independent outlets like ours. But I think defunding the CBC in some capacity, if not all capacity, I would like to obviously see it defunded in entire capacity, is what's going to make the difference for how the future of our country is shaped, because there is still a lot of people who tune into those shows, who especially read their stories and who are not thinking critically about these issues. When we look at the States, I know Donald Trump, President Trump, he recognized that the issues with media were one of the greatest problems facing his presidency, that he had a media that was out to get him. And it wasn't just the media, it was also things on social media. Of course, he tried to make Truth Social. That never really took off. But I think one of the things that we were really grateful for in independent media was Elon Musk actually buying Twitter and making it a place for free speech again. And we've seen a lot of improvement with that, especially basically being blacklisted on places like Facebook. Twitter is one of the main outlets that we have to get our news out nowadays. Of course, we also have YouTube, but there's a fair amount of censorship. So these are really the areas that we need to apply pressure on if we're going to want to see positive change in the country and make sure that people who wouldn't otherwise have heard of places like True North are able to hear us and that we're able to get our message out. Isaac, what's your take on this?
Yeah, obviously, I'm very grateful that Elon Musk, I guess, essentially took a financial loss in trying to fight for free speech in buying Twitter at the time, what is now known as X. Yeah, as you mentioned, yeah, it's one of the best ways, not only for us to get news out, but for me, and I'm sure many other young people and people, all sorts of Canadians, to consume news is through Twitter. And I think it always has, or sorry, X. I think it always has been that too, in that I remember seeing some data a few years ago in that like the most amount of politicians were on X as compared to other social medias. And so obviously it's always been kind of a political social media in that sense. So obviously it has a lot of influence, especially surrounding elections. It'll be interesting to see what happens in our next federal election, especially with the mainstream media and their potential fight against Poilievre and how hard they're going to be on him, which I know I think a lot of young people maybe aren't watching mainstream media as much, but I really do think that their main user base would probably be the older generation, as well as I'm thinking immigrants probably watch a lot of mainstream media, because I mean, if you just watch TV, those are probably the news channels you're going to watch, and then subsequently you'll probably follow their journalism online as well. So yeah, that's kind of what I think.
Well, everyone, that's about time for today. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of Off the Record. I believe Andrew Lawton will be back next week. I'm not going to make any promises, though. Thanks, Isaac, for joining us for your first ever video podcast. We'll hope that you'll be back for more. And William, of course, it's always great to get some insight on Alberta, as you know, you're an Alberta lifetimer. So we'll be back next week. We hope that you guys have a great weekend. Take care.
Rachel, is this where I remind you that my last name is McBeath?
Not McBeath. I was going to ask you before we started, and I was like, oh no, it's definitely McBeath. Oops, I forgot to say everything you've heard was off the record. I forgot that's how we closed it.